While the best part of every Resident Evil game is the main story itself, most games of the franchise usually feature an exciting and challenging bonus game that'll keep us entertained long after the story ends. So on this episode of Nerdspace Games, I'll be giving you guys my personal top 10 favorite bonus games within the Resident Evil franchise. With that being said, I won't be focusing on story-based modes like Separate Ways and Lost in Nightmares. I have a whole other different video dedicated to that already, so be sure to check that one out later. Instead, this list will focus on bonus games in each Resident Evil game, whether they come in the form of in-game content or DLC. But before we get started, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 best bonus games in Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, Elimination Showdown, Resident Evil Outbreak Files. I decided to start off today's list with an entry that combines two separate minigames into a single entry, both of which appear in the Resident Evil Outbreak games. While neither one of these modes really adds anything different, it does add an additional challenge for players wanting to experience certain aspects of Resident Evil Outbreak without having to go through each scenario again. For the elimination mode, players will need to go through every single room and clear out every single monster that they come across in their path. On top of that, weapons and resources are randomized, making the mode that much more challenging. Then, with the showdown mode, players can do a boss rush against all the boss fights of Resident Evil Outbreak. Number 9, Battle Game, Resident Evil Code Veronica. One of the most challenging trophies to get in Resident Evil Code Veronica is the one in which you must score an A rank for each character in the minigame called Battle Game. This bonus game is unlocked after completing the main story, and it's basically a timed challenge in which the player will need to race through multiple rooms, kill every enemy in their path, and then face off against a boss fight that's unique to the character chosen for the battle game. Obviously, the most challenging part about this trophy is Wesker's battle game, as he's only equipped with a combat knife. All in all, it's a race against time to take down a ton of zombies and other POWs as fast as possible with different weapons at your disposal depending on which character you have selected. Number 8, Agent Hunt and Predator, Resident Evil 6. Despite me not enjoying most aspects of RE6 when it came to the main story of the game, it's hard to deny the fact that Resident Evil 6 may very well be one of the most ambitious games of the entire series. Perhaps too ambitious? I mean, look at everything that Resident Evil 6 featured. 4 campaigns with each one of them having a completely different vibe to them. 6 different bonus modes, including a Mercenaries mode that to this day is argued as one of the best Mercenaries that we've ever seen in the Resident Evil series. And while the versus modes like Siege and Survivors were flops in my book, other modes like Agent Hunt and Predator were actually relatively fun for a while. So since they are similar to each other, I once again decided to include 2 games into a single entry on today's list. Both bonus games clearly took a lot of inspiration from one of the most popular and best asymmetrical horror games of all time, Left 4 Dead. Agent Hunt, for example, was similar to Left 4 Dead Versus mode, in which the player would have the opportunity to invade the main campaigns of other players in the form of BOWs. While Agent Hunt doesn't allow you to control any of the boss characters of the game, it pretty much gives you full control of multiple different monsters throughout the main campaigns of Resident Evil. Predator, on the other hand, randomly selects one of the players to be the infamous Ustanok boss from Jake's campaign, while the other players must face off against it. Again, this clearly takes inspiration from sequences seen in Left 4 Dead, such as players facing off against a tank controlled by a player on the opposing team. Number 7, Leech Hunter, Resident Evil 0. I thought about including Wesker mode on this list, as it's without a doubt one of my favorite modes in Resident Evil, but ultimately since it's pretty much the main game but with exclusive costumes for both Billy and Rebecca, complete with unique abilities for Wesker, I decided that's not really a bonus game but instead a bonus mode. It's kind of in the name, Wesker mode. Also kind of like Invisible Enemy mode or Real Survival mode in Resident Evil Remake, which by the way, both of those do not appear on today's list as well. And since this list is more focused on bonus games, I instead decided to include Leech Hunter from Resident Evil 0. Now, while it doesn't have the same replayability as Wesker mode, nor is it as exciting, Leech Hunter is still a fun minigame that involves a lot of strategy to 100% complete it. Essentially, the main goal of Leech Hunter is to pick up and leave with all 100 leeches scattered throughout the training facility. That of course is easier said than done. First off, the leeches are 2 different colors, and Billy can only pick up the blue ones while Rebecca can only pick up the green ones. On top of that, these leeches take up inventory space. To be exact, 10 leeches can fit into a single item slot. However, unlike other items, once you pick up a leech, you cannot drop them, meaning that the more leeches you have on you, the less inventory space you have at your disposal for weapons, ammo, and healing items. So, as I said earlier, completing this game is all about strategy. Still, once you learn how to manage your resources and take out all of the enemies before you start picking up the leeches, this mode, while tedious, is still fairly straightforward to complete. Number 6, Resistance, Resident Evil 3 Remake. One of the most underrated bonus games of the Resident Evil series is Resistance. This is an asymmetrical bonus game that released alongside Resident Evil 3 Remake. While this bonus game definitely does not make up for the cut content we missed out on with the remake of RE3, Resistance was actually an interesting concept to say the least. As I already said, Resistance was an asymmetrical bonus game in which it pits 4 survivors against a single mastermind. The mastermind would set the stage by sending different kinds of BOWs into the battlefield in an attempt to eliminate each and every survivor. The mastermind even had the ability to control different monsters, including major BOWs like William Birkin and Mr. X. Unfortunately, due to the overall disappointment of Resident Evil 3 Remake, most of the RE community gave up on Resistance early on, and for that reason, Capcom failed to support the bonus game for a long period of time. The potential was there though, and if Capcom continued to support this bonus game, they could have brought in other masterminds and other exciting BOWs. Sadly, that didn't happen, as Capcom would instead turn their attention to a far less exciting project, RE-verse. Still, Resistance was one of my favorite multiplayer modes of Resident Evil, and for that reason, it's one of my favorite bonus games of the entire RE series. Number 5, Ethan Must Die, Resident Evil 7. Not gonna lie, Ethan Must Die has made me rage quit more than any other bonus game on this list. So it feels a bit weird saying that this is one of the best bonus games in the series when I have never been more frustrated than I have been when playing through Ethan Must Die. But it's the challenge of this mode that really makes it so addicting, and it's one of those things that just really makes you feel like a true badass when you finally manage to complete it. Anyway, Ethan Must Die is a bonus game that released as part of the Banned Footage Volume 1 DLC pack. In this mode, Ethan Winters must make his way through the Baker Estate, starting in the front yard of the Baker Estate as seen in the main story of the game, before eventually coming face to face with Marguerite Baker in the greenhouse. However, the enemies are tougher and their spawns are much different than they were during the main game. On top of that, items and resources are completely randomized on each playthrough, as the player will find weapons and other resources in crates of various levels, which will make their journey through the estate different with each playthrough. Ethan Must Die is without a doubt one of the most challenging bonus games of the entire Resident Evil series. In fact, I would honestly argue that it's probably the hardest bonus game of the series. Despite saying that, due to the resources randomizing with each playthrough, each experience feels different compared to the one before it. And when you eventually find yourself completing this extremely difficult mode, you can't help but feel satisfied with yourself. For that reason, Ethan Must Die is both one of the most frustrating and rewarding experiences you'll ever come across in the Resident Evil series. Number 4, Assignment Ada, Resident Evil 4. Since we are only looking at bonus games and not story-based content, obviously I couldn't include separate ways on this list. With that being said though, there's another mode in the original Resident Evil 4 in which the player gets the opportunity to play as Ada Wong again. That of course being Assignment Ada, complete with an exclusive tactical outfit. Assignment Ada begins by following Ada as she arrives on the island section of the game. In this mode, Ada is sent by Wesker to retrieve multiple Plaga samples before evacuating the island. Essentially, this minigame is very similar to the Forced Survivor mode seen in Resident Evil 2, but while that mode was canon, Assignment Ada is not. After obtaining most of the samples except for the final one, Ada will then face off against the mode's final boss, Jack Krauser, before evacuating the island to deliver the samples to Albert Wesker. Between the soundtrack, the unique spy look for Ada Wong, and a mode that can be played through in a short session unlike Separate Ways, Assignment Ada is one of the most exciting bonus games seen in the Resident Evil series that gives us a new look at one of the most mysterious characters of the franchise, Ada Wong. Number 3, 21, Resident Evil 7. While every other entry on this list is combat focused, this bonus game from Volume 2 of the Banned Footage DLC for RE7 is not. Instead, it's exactly as it sounds. It's basically a game of 21, basically blackjack, but with more dire consequences. Now, before I dive more into what this minigame is, it is worth mentioning that technically speaking, 21 is actually considered canon, as it follows Clancy Jarvis after the events of the Bedroom DLC, but prior to the events of the Happy Birthday tape seen in the main game. Anyways, as I said earlier, 21 is basically a game of blackjack, but in the form of a trap created by Lucas Baker. With some similarities to the trap scene in the Saw franchise, the player must play multiple rounds of blackjack in order to beat the opposing player, Hoffman, which is probably another Easter egg to the Saw franchise. Anyways, the loser of each hand, depending on the mode, either loses one of their fingers or gets electrocuted. On top of the traditional 1 through 11 values as you would see in a normal game of blackjack, there are trump cards, which add a new layer to this already intense and highly addicting card game with high stakes. While not being as combat heavy as the rest of the entries on today's list, 21 is still one of the more addicting minigames of the entire RE franchise, and for that reason claims a spot in the top 5 best bonus games in the Resident Evil series. Number 2, Tofu Survivor, Resident Evil 2. Technically speaking, the fourth survivor is actually canon to the main story of RE2, and there's an argument that probably shouldn't be included on a list like this. Still, there's 2 workarounds to this rule. For one, fourth survivor feels less like story content and more like a bonus game, as it plays like a bonus game. As I said earlier, it's very similar to Assignment Ada. However, the easiest workaround to this rule is to just count Tofu Survivor for this list instead of fourth survivor, as clearly Tofu Survivor is non-canon. So to avoid complicating this list, Tofu Survivor is the bonus game that we'll be focusing on for this entry. Anyway, this is a bonus game that has appeared in both the original and the remake of RE2. After completing both scenarios of the main game, whether you're playing the remake or the original, the player will then unlock the 4th Survivor mode. After completing 4th Survivor, the player will unlock Tofu Survivor. Both modes are essentially a time bonus game in which the player will portray Hunk, the Grim Reaper, or Tofu, a giant piece of tofu. Regardless of which version you're playing through though, the player will need to rush through the RPD station and reach the evacuation point before the time runs out. Along the way, they'll come across just about every single monster they saw in the main game, including Mr. X. Tofu Survivor is essentially the same exact thing as the 4th Survivor, but with 2 major differences. Instead of portraying Hunk, as I said earlier, you'll play as a big piece of tofu. However, the more difficult change is the fact that Tofu is equipped with nothing but a combat knife, meaning that you won't be able to blast your way through the RPD station like you could when you were playing as Hunk. Oh, and let's not forget the badass soundtrack that comes along with both versions of this iconic bonus game of Resident Evil 2 and its remake. Number 1, Mercenaries, multiple games. Was there really any doubt about which bonus game of the Resident Evil series would claim the number 1 spot? I mean, of course not. Mercenaries has and probably always will be the most addicting, iconic, and most fun bonus games in the Resident Evil series. In fact, Mercenaries has appeared in just about every mainline Resident Evil game since it was first introduced in RE3 Nemesis. I won't go as far as saying which is my favorite Mercenaries mode, as that's a list I'll have to revisit in the future at some point, but each version of this mode has had its ups and downs throughout the years. Yeah, for the most part, Mercenaries has received mostly positive feedback every time it made its way into a Resident Evil game. The premise of this mode is simple enough: take iconic Resident Evil characters, throw them into an endless onslaught of BOWs in a timed event, and then see how many enemies they can kill before time runs out. Yeah, it's a feature that continues to come back again and again, with improvements and changes made over time. Hell, Mercenaries was so popular that it even got its very own spin-off game. Overall, you can't deny the popularity of the Mercenaries mode and how much replayability it adds to each Resident Evil game. So for that reason, there's no doubt in my mind when I say that Mercenaries mode, seen in multiple Resident Evil games, is without a doubt the best bonus game seen in the RE franchise. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Mercenaries the best bonus game in Resident Evil, or is there a different minigame that deserves that title? Also, don't forget to let me know in the comments down below as to if I missed any exciting and great bonus games seen in the Resident Evil series. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.